Hello, Mike.
Hello there.
Mike Doodson is my guest today, and we have a conversation about traveling, food, work, independence, writing, languages, and enjoying life. Can you tell us about your career, how it started, and what did you study, and all these experiences about traveling?
Well, for 40 years, I've been a journalist writing about Formula One motor racing, which has involved traveling the world. But in fact, I started as an accountant. I studied and I actually qualified as a chartered accountant. And my father always told me that a good accountant is able to tell his clients exactly what their financial position is. So he said that being able to write was a natural result of being an accountant. In fact, I started writing for my club newsletter up in the north of England. And that led to me working as a freelance journalist, writing about little races here and there in England. And then one weekend, I heard from the magazine that I was working for as a freelance. They said that one of their reporters had decided to go and do something different. And suddenly I had the job of writing about international racing. So I went from being an accountant to being a full international journalist in the space of one weekend, which was quite exciting.
And this really show us how abilities and gifts and the talent that the person has is part of a destiny, because traveling, how many countries have you been going in this reporting and journalist work?
Well, my work as a journalist in motor racing coincided with a period when motor racing suddenly became very popular. Formula One races started to be shown on international television. And so a lot of countries around the world which previously had not had races suddenly had them. So instead of just going to Europe and a couple of races in North America, I started going to South America, and went to South Africa, went to Asia, particularly in Japan, which I enjoyed very much. So my career expanded because Formula One expanded.
And how the languages or the importance of going to all these different countries regarding communications and how to speak with people, how did you prepare for that field?
Well, it's very kind of you to say I prepared. I didn't. I was just lucky that I spoke French. In fact, my mother had been educated in Switzerland and spoke French. And she was determined that I and my sister should learn languages from an early age. And that helped me enormously, because when I started writing, French was the second language of most people, and it was the language of the International Federation. But knowing French helped me with all the other Latin languages. And the first Latin languages I really got to learn to speak after French was actually Portuguese, because I spent quite a lot of time in Brazil. There were a lot of Brazilian drivers racing in Formula One, and there were quite a lot of races there. And I loved Brazil, and I always arranged to spend a lot of time there. And so I picked up Portuguese. But I also speak.
I like the way how you tell the story. Your first time when you arrived to Brazil, when you leave England in winter, how it was. Can you remind me that experience? That I loved the way how you tell that experience.
Well, I was invited to go to Brazil for a series of Formula 3 races. I was right at the beginning of the Brazilian domination of Formula 1, if you'd like to call it that. And I was sent a ticket to go to Sao Paulo. It was in January, and I'll never forget taking off in the plane from Heathrow in the snow and landing in Rio in the sunshine.
Oh,
And then we flew down to Sao Paulo, and there was actually a big sign in the airport, because this was the time of the military government in Brazil, and they wanted people to feel patriotic. And there was a sign which said, "Ame-o ou deixe-o," and that means, in Portuguese, that means love it or leave it. But it looked very strange to me, and I decided that I had to learn this language, and I was able to pick it up. I was lucky because the arrangement for me as a journalist visiting Brazil was that I had my hotel paid for. I got a newspaper in the morning, and there was also a TV, so I could read the newspaper and knew more or less what the words were, and I switched on the TV and learned how to pronounce them. It's a strange way of learning a language, but it worked for me.
also was very important because year tras year in the in the Formula One visits, you were as well having a great party when you were 40.
Well, when I turned 40, it happened to be on the weekend when we were at a Grand Prix in Rio de Janeiro. And somebody who was the team manager of the Lotus team, he and I were good friends, and he arranged for me to have a party on a yacht near Ilha Bela. And it was something that I'll remember forever, because a lot of my good friends were there, but also we could jump off the yacht and into the sea, and it was so clear and transparent. And that's in March, and back in England, it was still pretty cold. And I thought that was the best way you could spend a birthday party.
Absolutely.
I have to say that there was quite a lot of cachaça was being drunk. And I remember the beginning, but I can't remember the end of it, but I'm sure I had a good time.
Absolutely. And going back to languages, communication, and culture, what do you find about the humor, the difference between Anglo-Saxon and Latin American humor?
Well, I always find that that cultures are quite different when it comes, especially when it comes to humor. And there's definitely a difference between Anglo-Saxon humor, which relies heavily on irony, and shall we say Hispanic humor. The extraordinary thing is that although English humor does not work on Spanish-speaking people, it works perfectly well in Brazil. The Brazilians have a very Anglo-Saxon sense of humor, and that seems a very strange difference to me, because it's not just the language, it's also a part of their culture.
And how was this anecdote in Spain while you were studying Spanish in Menorca, while we live in Menorca? You took some Spanish lessons.
Yes, I took some Spanish lessons when we were living in Menorca, and there were a lot of different nationalities in these classes, because a lot of different European people go to live in the Balearic Islands. So there were French and German and Swedish-speaking people, but there were also 4 or 5 construction workers who came from Morocco, because there was a lot of work going on in Menorca at the time. And the teacher and I had a pretty good relationship, and I used to make little jokes with him, and he enjoyed my jokes because he had an English wife and he understood English irony. And he turned to these Moroccans who were looking a bit puzzled, and said, perhaps you don't know what irony is. So he had a dictionary which translated from Spanish to Arabic, and he checked out the word irony in Arabic, and he couldn't find it. So we decided there and then that the problem with people who speak Arabic don't understand irony because the word doesn't even exist in their language.
Okay, and talking about food, because you love very good food, as you cook as well really well, and you are a very gourmet in your palate. Can you tell us about the best restaurants or experiences that you had related with restaurants and countries?
Well, I'm in the car business, and people in the car business, both the people who make the cars and the people who publicize them, they tend to like good food. So when they're taking us abroad for introduce us to new cars, we tend to get very well fed. We go to good restaurants. So I have a taste for good restaurants. The only problem is I can't afford them, which is why I learned to cook. I think if you can't afford a restaurant, the best compensation is to cook it for yourself. But I do like good restaurants, and I've been lucky to visit some very good ones. And generally speaking, I find Italian food is even better than French food, which is quite amusing, really, because if you think about it, it was the Italians who taught the French how to cook.
And connected with this experience, did you have a bet and were taken to...
I know what you want to talk about.
Yes.
This again, I suppose, is a bit of contrasting culture, because in 1983, I had a bet at the beginning of the season with a colleague of mine. He'd been the editor of a magazine that I worked for. He was a Frenchman, and he'd gone to work for Renault as their press officer. And he was particularly close to the French driver, Alain Prost, who was a very good driver. But in 1983, Prost was driving a Renault, which was unreliable. And the driver that I was most friendly with and liked most was the Brazilian called Nelson Piquet. And he was driving a British car with a German engine, which is a pretty good combination. Anyway, at the beginning of the year, my French friend and I had a little bet of $50. He wanted to bet on Prost being world champion, and I wanted to bet on Piquet being world champion. Well, 3 races before the end of the season, Prost had a narrow lead in the world championship on points. And my French friend, we were at a dinner where quite a lot of wine had been drunk, and he started taunting me and saying, "What about my Prost now? He's going to be world champion." And I said, "No way, no Frenchman will ever be world champion." Which irritated him so much, he said, "Okay, let's increase the bet." "How much?" And I said, "Okay, by 10 times. Instead of $50, let's make it $500. Well, to cut a long story short, I won the bet. And my French friend, the public relations man from Renault, had to pay me $500. Which was a good thing, because 3 days after the last race, where the championship was decided, I got married for the first time. And I did not have $500. And my future wife would have been very unhappy if we'd started our marriage with a debt of $500 to a Frenchman.
Absolutely. In a case of an English, yes. And also, before you marry, you have a very good goodbye to be a single person in Paris.
Well, actually, yes. It was a good, it's what we call in England, your stag night. Because after that final race, which was in South Africa on a Saturday, I had to fly back to Paris to work on the magazine where I was reporting at the time. And it was very hard work. And I worked 2 nights almost without sleep. And on the Wednesday morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, I was with an English colleague and I said to him, Bob, if you can find a restaurant that's still open at this time of night, I said, I'll buy dinner for you and we'll have a very good bottle of wine. And he did know about a restaurant. There's a place called the Val d'Isère on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, which stays open all night long. And we went up there and we were both exhausted. And we sat down, ordered a bottle of wine. And I looked around and there was a group of people in the middle of the restaurant, and it was the Rolling Stones. All of the Rolling Stones except Mick Jagger. They'd been making a record in Paris. They were with their wives and girlfriends and drug pushers or who else. And then there were about 6 or 7, shall we say, single women all sitting around at single tables around the room. They were ladies of the night who were having a little break. So if anybody ever asks me about how I spent my stag night, I can always tell them the truth, which is that I spent it with the Rolling Stones and 6 prostitutes.
Unforgettable. How nice. And being a Colombian person, I want a very small story, but wonderful, about San Andres and $10.
Well, this was at the end of my first trip to South America, which was more than 40 years ago. And part of the arrangement was that I went to Colombia for 2 Formula 2 races, which I held in Bogota. And it was arranged for the drivers that if they wanted to get away between these 2 races, they could go to a place called San Andres. I had no idea that it was a little island, but anyway, I was persuaded to go there, and the cost of the plane ticket there was $75, which somebody else paid for me and said I could pay him back later. What I didn't tell him was that all I had left after my trip around South America was $10. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was taken to the local casino by a top racing driver. In fact, he was 2 times world champion, Graham Hill. And he said, have you ever played roulette? I said, never. And he told me how I could play it, and you could bet on black or you could bet on red. And I actually bet 4 times, and I turned my $10 into $80. And Graham got pretty excited. He said, hey, you're on a roll. You're going to win a lot of money. Where do we turn to next? And I said, no, I owe this man $75 and now I can pay him back. And that's the end of my gambling trip. And that was the one time I ever went into a casino. I went in with $10 and came out with 80, and I've never been back.
Well done. Okay, just to finish our nice stories from you, do you regard yourself as lucky person?
Well, after telling you all those stories, I think you probably get a pretty good idea that I am a lucky person. Well, how much more lucky can a man be than to be married to a beautiful Colombian girl?
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Was great stories, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.